So with the NFL season winding down, I decided to look at some injuries that occurred in the past that everybody remembers. Everybody remembers Ryan Shazier and his back injury.
His legs moved at all since the hit. He immediately grabbed for his middle of his back, was able to roll over onto his back, but his legs really have not moved from that position since he's been on the ground.
Now, I'm a spine surgeon, so I feel I can talk about something like this. So if you remember, 2017, December, playing against the Bengals, Ryan Shazier made a tackle and immediately collapsed on the ground, and he was clutching his back. I've looked through everything I can find about this injury, and there isn't much. They say that he had a spinal contusion. He had surgery a couple days later. But here's the key thing. He was paralyzed. He had no motor function in his lower extremities. And now he's back to walking. He's not playing anymore. I probably wouldn't be either if I'd been injured like that and everything came back after years of rehab and being able to finally get back to walking. I think I'd probably just cash in my chips and be done, just like he did. So this is what I think happened to Ryan Shazier. I think he had something called a burst fracture. Okay, so let's go through the spinal cord really quickly and talk about how things related to each other. So in this cross-section and a side view of the spine, you can see that there's a tube called the spinal canal. Okay, your spinal cord lives in that spinal canal. So the spinal cord starts from where the brain is, continues down, stops at the level between L1 and L2 vertebra, and then nerves continue to come off the spinal cord and then go down into your lower extremities. So anything that happens upstream is going to affect everything downstream. That just makes sense, right? So the spinal cord is vulnerable to injury when forces are transmitted to it. So in trauma, like accidents, in trauma like hits in football, that energy can be transferred to the spine. Now, if you remember from your high school physics class, there's kinetic energy and potential energy. Kinetic energy is the energy of something in motion. Potential energy is the energy that's stored in something that's stationary. Okay, so in the case of Ryan Shazier, if you look at the tackle he made, he tackled the opposing player. You can draw a straight line from the top of his head all the way down to his foot. Okay, so the energy that's being transmitted is being transmitted down that spinal column. Now, we talked about kinetic energy and potential energy. He had a lot of kinetic energy. The player he was tackling had this potential energy. Even though he was moving, he was not moving as fast as Ryan was when he launched himself into him. So he transmits that kinetic energy, but also remember in physics that rule, one of Newton's rules, for each action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So some of that energy is also transmitted back through his spine. Now, in the spine, when you have an axial force like that, you can get what are called burst fractures, and they usually occur at the thoracolumbar junction, which is the area where the thoracic spine meets the lumbar spine. And it usually happens somewhere between T10 and L2. Now, the reason that happens is because the thoracic vertebra, 12 of them, vertebra 1 through 10, are also connected to the ribs that attach the spine to your sternum. So you really have this stable kind of configuration. Ribs 11 and 12 are floating ribs, so they're much more mobile. This is where most of the injuries occur when you have burst fractures, T10 to L2. Think of a burst fracture this way. If you were to get an empty can and smash your hand on top of it, it would do this, it would burst, right? Now remember that canal, the spinal canal that we were talking about? When you have that burst fracture, that posterior part of that vertebral body can push back into the spinal canal and injure the spinal cord. That fragment may stay there, or that fragment may be sucked back in because it's still attached to the ligaments that hold it there. So what I think happened with Ryan, because I look at the timeline, he wasn't operated until a couple days later. It looked to me like he had a transfer of force into his spinal column. He had a burst fracture. He's clutching kind of his mid-thoracic upper lower back. So it kind of tells me that's the area where burst fracture happens. He also can't move his legs, which means that he had injury to his spinal cord. In what I can see, that's been reported, he had a spinal contusion. Remember that impact we're talking about happening to the spinal cord? That's probably what happened. So, treatment of thoracolumbar burst fractures is kind of controversial depending on whether you're going to operate or not operate. There are certain situations where you just operate right away. So if a person has a spinal cord injury, you can see bones sticking inside the canal pressing on the spinal cord, and if that spine is unstable, you need to decompress that spinal canal and stabilize that spine. Okay? He wasn't operated on right away, so I think what happened is he had a burst fracture, but when they got the CT scan, the MRI, it showed that there was a fracture, but there wasn't necessarily a bone fragment sticking in the canal anymore, or if it wasn't that big and it wasn't pressing on the spinal cord, but he was paralyzed, right? Now, there's another thing that happens when the spinal cord has an injury to it called spinal shock. You lose all your reflexes. So, the reflexes when you tap on the patella, you tap on the ankles, they're just not there. There are other reflexes that we won't talk about because it's a little TMI, but those are gone too. Rectal tone is probably gone as well. That usually resolves within 72 hours if things are going to come back. And when you see that, there's a chance that everything else is going to come back as well. So I think what probably happened with Ryan is they saw that he recovered from spinal shock, and they said, well, let's stabilize him so he doesn't further injure himself. He could have been put in a brace, but I probably would have operated on him at that point also to stabilize his spine and prevent any further injury from happening. The other thing that they may have seen in the MRI is that the ligaments in the back of the spine may have also been torn. And those are kind of like the tether lines on a tent. Okay? If you cut those, that tent's going to be kind of floppy and not as stable. Same principle applies there. So what they probably did, and I think, well, actually, I'm pretty sure this is what they did. They put hardware in the spine and fused that level of a spine to prevent any further damage happening to his spinal cord. They may also have done a laminectomy to open up the area if there was something that was protruding inside there and they wanted to make sure that he was not getting any further damage from compression. So, I've actually seen this once in my career. As a resident, I had a patient who was shot, unfortunately, and the bullet, it didn't actually go through his spine, but it caused a hematoma, pressure on that spine, and the transmission of force into that spine made him paralyzed. I remember that patient telling me that he was determined to walk again. So, fast forward about 2 years, I was walking through the grocery store parking lot, and I heard somebody yell out my name, Doc. My name's not Doc, but he yelled out my name, Dr. Okumu. And I looked, and this van drives up, and this guy jumps out, and it's him. He was walking again. So, spinal cord injuries occur. They're catastrophic, but people can recover. We just don't know who's going to recover. There's some injuries that people are more likely to recover from than others, but then there are also injuries where we just have to do what we can and then see what happens with time. Now, everybody's heard about G-forces, right? That's the force that gravity applies to the body. We know about G-forces in airplane pilots, astronauts. We know about G-forces in car accidents and so forth. Well, you can also calculate those in football hits, right? So the football hit, the force from a football tackle is about 150 Gs. That's 150 times what gravity does to the body. Now, contusions happen at about 100 Gs. We talked about contusions not so long ago. 150 Gs, 1,600 pounds of force. That's almost like a ton of force on a person's spine. You can see how easily that can injure a spine. So I think Ryan Shazier probably had a thoracolumbar burst fracture that injured his spine, caused a spinal cord injury. They stabilized it. They may have decompressed that level of the spine, and then he just went through intensive rehab. So if you think of the spinal cord as a big cable with a bunch of wires, electrical wires going through it, a spinal cord injury can do several things. It could damage that cable by cutting completely through it, transecting it, or it could damage that cable by just transmitting force to it and damaging some of those wires that are running through it. In the spine, you have these tracts of fibers that are similar to those wires that we're talking about. They're running all the way through it. So if you damage those, they have to repair in some way, right? And it takes time. There's a whole process for these nerve regeneration to happen. We don't completely fully understand it, but it does happen. But like Ryan Shazier's case, he had to go back and retrain everything in his lower extremities because those fibers were cut. Healing can occur. What happens is the brain figures out new ways to get those signals from the brain all the way down to your lower extremities. So part of the retraining he went through was for his brain to understand which fibers were still working and how it can reroute to get the signals down to his legs so they can work.